what you call malady, that kind of sickness of soul. And that's all it's for. If there's no sickness of soul to begin with, and that's why I'm using this language, then there's no reason to take this medicine. But because there is a pervasive tendency towards this, then you take the medicine. But he's saying here, understand the medicine is not something you want to hang on to or get addicted to or think is a cure. All it's doing is removing the impediment that prevents your natural health from manifesting in and of itself. This is really important to understand, because otherwise you could fall into this sort of deep dependency on meditation and think without it there's no way I could be liberated, free, and open my natural wisdom, which is not the case here. So, in fact, we're translating a passage last night. This is from Great Master Han Shan, who's saying essentially the same thing. It's only because of this confusion that we create these all expedient devices to restore health. And he says, even my teachings, I regret that I have to say them because, it's a little bit too much even. But I'll say it because I have to. But he says, and in the same way, and the great expression we were wrestling with last night was this funny Chinese expression. Now I'm digressing. I hope I get back to the text. He says, the text says, you use a brick or a tile to knock on the door. And so we're going, who does that? In America, you don't use bricks to knock on doors. You're arrested if you do that. But you knock on the door, and once the door is open to respond, you no longer need the brick or the tile, and you put it down. In the same way, we take up a meditation topic to open our awakening, open our enlightenment. Once it's open, we can put the meditation topic down. This is the parallel. But we were trying to struggle last night with, if you translate to English, use a brick to knock on the door, most Westerners would go, what? So, but I think we'll leave it because it does have, or we'll wrestle with it. But it's the same, basically, it's the same like the parable of the raft, how you use the raft to get to the other shore. Once on the other shore, you no longer keep the raft. Now, I'm saying this only works if you have a very fundamental core teaching that says everything's okay, no problem. If everything's okay, no problem, then you can see all these things as just expedients and that you can pick up and use very efficiently. Very efficiently. And by efficient, I mean producing results. That's what I mean by efficient. Used efficiently, you'll get through, you're liberated, and you can move on. So his theory here is he's saying tonight, what I call meditation is simply the return and restoration of your original nature. It's not a posture, okay? He doesn't indicate and promote any posture here, nor is it a place that you have to do in a particular place. And nor is it even, he says, a practice. He doesn't even call it a practice. Now, it may start as a practice, but that's the medicinal part of it. Where it ends up is a way of being, an entire way of being that is without an inside, outside, without a beginning, middle, and end. It seamlessly becomes the whole of your life. And in fact, that's what he means by walking, standing, sitting, even lying down when it's in. I'll quote you a passage. This is from one of his, he was a disciple, but when he came in, he was already pretty advanced. And this is his name in this text. He becomes then known as Master Yung Jia. What was his name before he was called Yung Jia? Remember in the Lively Encounters? Anybody remember Yung Jia? That was a name he came not posthumously. I think it was later he was called this, right? Is it Shrenjie? Does it say how he got the name Yung Jia? I always do this to confuse people. Huh? Shrenjie. And then he became, what does the text say about him becoming Yung Jia? 82? Yeah, it says Master Shrenjie, but then you go on, Shrenjie, and then it says at the end of 84, he awakened, he had a profound awakening, and from then on, he was known as the overnight awakened one. I like that. Later he wrote the Song of Awakening, which I'm going to read you a section from here, which circulated widely. His posthumous title became Wu Xiang, Great Master Beyond Knowing, and in his time he was known as Truly Awakened Zhen Jue. So he goes by many names, which tells you something. So, just as Buddha is not a person, but an adjective describing someone who's awakened, so too these names only become descriptive of qualities of the person, or as they transform along the way and don't become, monikers of identity. I am so-and-so, Duke of so-and-so, heir to the da-da-da, and all that identity set up with the family name. They only have names that describe a transforming path they're on. In fact, if you wanted to say what Buddhism is, I would say it's not a religion, it's not even a philosophy, it's a transformative teaching, or it's a teaching of transformation. It's a teaching that leads you into change and transformation that restores and goes back to your root and returns to your nature. So I would call it a transformative teaching. And then well, is it something you believe in? Sure. But transformative teaching means something you do, something you work with. Believing it is good. That's probably a first step, but just believing in it won't get you transformed. No matter how hard you believe, you actually have to, take it up. Yes?
So, Alan was right on page 82, the first sentence after Chan Master Shenjue. It says, Chan Master Shenjue of Yongjia was from 5 families. So he was Master Shenjue of Yongjia.
So he was named after his place. And so, in this case, we're going to refer to him as Yongjia. But let me read you this passage from, it's called a Song of Awakening because I guess it's in a verse form. And of course, again, if you read it in English, you don't get the poetic sense. But if you read the Chinese, you don't have it, do you?
I don't have Chinese.
Okay. Let me give you, just to give you a sense of the poetics, would you come up here just for a second? Here. No. Just read, the first couple lines of the opening here in the Chinese, and then I will, right there.
First line?
Yeah, give us a poetic vibe here.
君不见，绝学无为闲荡人，不除妄想，不求真。无名实性，即佛性。幻化空生，是法身。
好极了. Okay. I would have done that, but my voice is a little rough. Okay. So let me read you then this passage when I was saying, so you don't think that I'm making this up, that he is saying it's not a particular place, it's not a particular practice, and it's not a particular time. None of these apply. And here's from a Yongjia Song Awakening. He says, walking is dhyana, you say, or chan, or meditation. Walking is dhyana. Sitting is also dhyana. In speech or silence, in movement or stillness, my body's at peace. I'm at peace. So what he's describing the thing that Master Sixth Patriarch is getting at here, that what he calls his single practice samadhi. It means an equanimity and an unmoving clarity in all deportments, at all times, in all places. And that's why later he says, to the enlightened person, all places are the same. And so here then he's setting up this idea that you don't have to be sitting to do this practice, what he calls the meditation. And then this line here, I want to just review a little bit and then we'll move on. He says, the mistake is sometimes you take up a meditation practice where you fixate on the mind. Somehow you think you're fixating on the mind, or you fixate on purity. And he's saying neither of those will work. My teacher had a wonderful way of putting it. I was trying to remember how he said, if you fixate on the mind, you have two minds, and neither of them is true. And if you fixate on purity, you have now created two purities, and neither of those are true. And he said basically the first one is because the mind is an illusion, it's not a thing and an entity fixating on it, you have nothing true there. But the second one is that fixating on purity says you are naturally whole, pure, by yourself. There's nothing lacking. But as soon as you seek for it, as soon as you attach to it, as soon as you grab for it, you take what's true and make it false. So that the saying, there is no mind and no purity to get, means simply let the mind be unattached, wanting, clinging, seeking nothing. That is purity, and that is true mind. As soon as you entertain a thought, a feeling of wanting one of those things or the other, you take what's true and turn it into false, and you don't get anything from it. So that was the way he would render it. You'd have two minds, neither is true. You have two purities, neither of which is pure. Simply letting the mind be unattached, clinging to nothing, seeking nothing, wanting nothing, is true purity and stillness. So then he goes on to say, this next passage, and the many times that we've gone over this, I still come back to, I wonder why he does this all the time about not finding fault. Because it's so much fun. It's just a hoot to find fault. Wow. I mean, all you have to do is turn on the news for 3 minutes and you can find fault. Listen to the debates, find fault. You can walk down the street in your car. I'm finding fault all the time with people, how they drive. And so the fault-finding mind is strangely, seemingly, why is such a profound text talking about something so mundane and quotidian as fault-finding? Because it is pervasive. Not only, and when we run out of, run out of people and things to find fault with, then we find fault with ourselves. And not in a constructive way. We beat ourselves up. Whew. So here he says, good and wise friend, someone who cultivates not moving, and he's using this expression, not moving, to convey a deep meaning. There is a misunderstanding of not moving, which is that you are motionless in your sitting. You sit for long periods of time without moving. That's called unmoving meditation. And it also implies a sort of emotional, affective flatness, almost like you are impassive, implacable. What's some of the other words? You don't move, right? No matter what, you show no emotion or feelings. And this is considered to be unmoving. Any other words? Try our little thesaurus brains here.
Solid, unflappable.
Unflappable. Uncaring. Unattached, meaning I don't care about anything. Indifferent. He's saying that's not what not moving means. Not moving means something else. So that's why he says, those who cultivate non-moving. And he's saying, how would you tell somebody who's really cultivating? When they observe other people, they do not notice their rights or wrong, good or bad sides, or their faults or failings. Justice is unmoving essential nature. Now, why does he say that? Why doesn't he say, looking at the 10,000 things, they don't turn left or right, they don't get excited or depressed? He goes right into this. I have some theories about it. So unless somebody's going to jump in, I'll just spout my theories and then you can. One is they're in community. This is a community of people he's talking to. And as you know, a community of one, there's usually no problem. As soon as there's two, there's problems. And of course, that was because you let the other person in. And if you let 3 people into your community, you got 3 more problems. You're not a problem. And the more people you have, the more problems. And so he's in a community here. So you can bet in a community of people who are trying to cultivate the way and restraining their desires and passions and trying to be holy, there's going to be some chi rising. There's going to be some sparks flying. Moreover, they're eating and living in a regulated way, which means they don't just hop out to the fast food place when they're hungry, but they eat at regular times, they do ceremonies and rituals, and anytime you put a harness on the id, on the ego, it doesn't go, oh, thank you, I feel so good being subdued. No. It's like, let me out of this. We bristle at being controlled or disciplined. And so the first way that this cultivation of oneself, where you're returning the light to illumine within, the immediate response of returning to light is not to illumine within, but to shoot it out at somebody else. That's just what happens. And it's a shortcut for thinking you've arrived. Because if you can find fault with everybody, you naturally feel a bit superior. And everybody else is below you. And this is the problem. He's saying that fault finding then keeps you from cultivating and transforming yourself. Moreover, I would argue, it also keeps you from transforming others. So let me go into this a little bit. The first reason I think he brings out fault finding is just simply your energy and your attention, your mindfulness is going to looking for, and I mean fault finding, he means fault finding. You're actually going out actively looking for this. And it turns into then a kind of censure that you pronounce on others, or what I would like to call is a judgmentalism. There's a kind of pervasive judgmentalism where you're weighing in and judging, moving people away, and rejecting or dismissing or making inferior to you and so forth. So the result is your energy that should be available for your own transformation and changing your own difficulties, bad habits and faults is now being used. There's a certain amount of energy. It's now going out to radiate on everybody else. So just in that very basic sense, the energy you need to transform is no longer there. It's gone out. So in that sense, it's an outflow. And it's very alluring. It can be very attractive. You can think, wow, I am so righteous. I am so right on. I can see through everybody's little faults and blah, blah, blah. You might even keep a record of it in your diary. Or today, so-and-so really pissed me off. There she goes again with blah, 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 blah. And you kind of think, Amitofo, Amitofo. What am I contemplating? I'm contemplating other people's faults. Now, the other part of this also is people will say, well, what are you supposed to do? Obviously, people aren't Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. We live with ordinary, fault-ridden, afflicted beings, and someone's got to shape them up, and if nobody's going to do it, you're thinking the sixth ground of the Avatamsaka, if nobody's going to do it, I'll do it, says Bodhisattva fault finding. But that's not a true name. I'm just throwing that out. The thing that's going on here, though, is it doesn't mean a cultivator of the way or a teacher or even a fellow Dharma friend doesn't see and notice somebody else's shortcomings and habits and so forth. But the lens with which they see it is to see it therapeutically and not judgmentally. They see it as an ailment, as an illness, as an affliction that's tying that person up and not letting them be their true selves. That attitude alone changes the whole atmosphere. If you don't see it as there's something wrong, they're impure, they're inferior, they're sick, and they're, you in your mind have now cut them off, and you've created an incredible amount of aversion both within your own heart, because you've dried up your own seeds of compassion, which is the feeling of oneness, but you've also then effectively cut them off, because what you're saying to them is, you don't count, you don't matter, I show you no respect, I reject you. Now, that can be done either by rejection or arrogance or just ignoring, but the vibe is there. You know the feeling. However, if it's seen as a way, when you go to the doctor, let me give you this example, and the doctor just says, oh my gosh, that must hurt. I see that bone sticking out, that must hurt. Let's see what we can do to, the whole different thing. But if when you went to the doctor was, oh, you sick slob, what have you done to yourself now? You've hurt again? I don't deal with people, and boom, out. Rejection, judgmentalism, or how could you be so stupid as to break your arm or something? The effect is totally different. So when the Sixth Patriarch, you'll see in these live encounters, when people come to him, and obviously they do have faults and shortcomings, he doesn't not attend to them. Okay, that's not what it's saying. But he doesn't judge and dismiss them. But he sees it as a knot that needs to be untied, and then he effectively goes and tries to untie that knot to liberate them from this thing, rather than to judge and remove them from his community or themselves. See the difference? So there's a famous Confucian passage, I don't know which one it is. My friend and colleague Henry Rosemont likes to cite it. He says there's a mistaken notion in Confucianism that you just follow the rules and you maintain your position in relational, and especially for children, you don't struggle or disobey your parents. The notion of filial piety is that you do whatever your parents tell you to do. He says, no, it's wrong. There's a strong strand of Confucian in what he calls remonstrance. And you're to remonstrate, to take issue when issue needs to be taken. So if something is not according to the way and the Tao, you not just bend over and let it go. But he says, when, for example, and this is, I don't know what the text is, when an understudy or a prince or a minister has a bad king, the king is bad, okay? I know that's hard to imagine these days because we have all supremely bright and wise leaders and we don't have, but in the past, occasionally kings would go bad. And the disciple, who's a minister, says he should be remonstrated. He should be confronted with this, because to not speak truth to power when it's time and when it can be done is actually a mistake. So therefore he says, but before I do this, I ask myself two questions. First of all, is he open to a message? You know? And then secondly, even if he is, do I have the wherewithal, both morally and virtue and just social ability, to make a connection here and have a change? So he said, even if he's open and I don't have that, I can't remonstrate. And even if I have ability to, but it's not open, it's not going to work. And so this thing, again, I think is a therapeutic model, but it's a model that's more reasonable to sort of look at this coming from compassion and just common sense. If you approach somebody in this way, where your heart is in the sense of, I want to help them get untied from this knot. It must be miserable to have these kinds of things. And at the same time, I have to have a certain amount of compassion, virtue in myself in order to do that, that they don't get the message that I'm rejecting or finding fault, but that I'm actually trying to help, then it'll work. So I want to make sure we read this passage of, you just don't simply go around with your eyes closed and don't pay attention to other people. But the attitude with which you do it, the manner with which you do it, makes all the difference. And that's why he says it's fault-finding. Untying knots and liberating is not fault-finding. That's very different. And so my teacher used to scold us when we were scolding others. And he said, how come when you scold others, they run away, and when I scold them, they come back for more? And I had no answer but to realize that his scolding was actually therapeutic and mine was egotistical. Slight difference. Yeah, but the effects were totally different, right? And they came back for more because what he pointed out to them, sometimes through a scolding, was an untying of a knot, was an opening of a space. And then there could be a transformation. Now, maybe it didn't happen immediately. Maybe they reacted at the time and said, you're a stupid teacher, I'm out of here. I said, okay, yeah, it's okay, you go. I don't know wherever you're going to go, you're going to still be with yourself, but that's okay, go. And then eventually they think about it and come back and realize there was no malice in there. There was no ego in there. There was no attempt to, manipulate or move me. It was completely just wide open, like a mother just giving what was needed. So I'll give you an example. I'll tell the story at the end. No, I'll go on. But remind me to tell the story at the end, because it was my learning experience along this. So he says that's not unmoving. Not moving means you respond, but you're not projecting. Good and wise friends, deluded people might make their bodies immobile, but as soon as they open their mouths, they gossip about others' rights and wrongs, their good qualities and shortcomings, and in doing so, they turn their backs on the way. So and then he concludes, if you fixate the mind on clinging to purity, it just obstructs the way. I have to interpret this passage as one of the ways that we misunderstand clinging to purity, because why is this last sentence in here? It's going fault find, da-da-da. I think what he's saying is you think you're pure because you're finding the faults of others. I alone am pure, others are impure. I alone am sober, everybody else is drunk. That kind of notion is a fixation on your own purity, and he's saying that's where it leads. It leads to a dichotomy between yourself and others. Instead of saying, as I have been afflicted and so forth, now I see someone else, and there's a compassionate wanting to release that. Here he's saying your fixation on purity is to establish yourself as some standard, which then leads to the judgmentalism. This is very subtle, but I think they have to look at that through that line at the end there. Okay, we go to the next page. The master continued. Now, I want to imagine, because I know this, we could just do the reading and go over these words here. But for a moment, allow yourselves to imagine that he's talking to a pretty big assembly, and you have a lot of people who are practicing. You could say people who are believers in various Confucian, Taoist, Buddhist things. You also have a lot of high officials and gentry. I mean, this drew quite a crowd. Now you have to imagine, this did not go down like a piece of candy, this last piece, I'm sorry. You know, I mean, the way he would deliver it, which is a very strong voice, he is obviously talking to not only us now, because we can resonate with this, but the people in the group must have been a little uncomfortable at this point. They're not getting, oh, you're here, so good, you're reciting the Buddha's name 10,000 times, as they say in Chinese, Gongda Wuliang, limitless merit for you. And he's not sort of saying, oh, look at her, she can sit in meditation for 12 hours. And there's people who are doing this there. So you have to imagine, he's not just giving an impartial sort of general statement. He is hitting on a number of points that people are attached or thinking in terms of their purity, because sometimes purity turns into ritual purity. Okay? And ritual purity, there's an actual term for this in a wrong view and within Buddhism, whereas you take rituals and ceremonies and you turn them into something that becomes an attachment because you think they are efficacious in themselves rather than they're symbolic of transformation. For example, bathing in the water, thinking that just bathing in the water with certain incantations suddenly magically makes something pure. Or using fire, or sacrifices, or offerings. And we know, in many societies, people will, there's not much anymore, I don't think, human sacrifice, but there's animal sacrifice, there's ritual sacrifice, there's blood sacrifice. Just about every movie that comes out of Hollywood is a form of blood sacrifice, but I won't go into that, I'm going to editorialize here a bit. Anyhow, the rituals and devotions and ceremonies become attached as dimensions of purity. This is fixating on purity as well. So it's not just fixating on my own sense of purity, it's fixating on an external causation, what we would call Wai Dao. In other words, that the deliverance, the liberation, comes in the performance of these rituals and devotions in and of themselves without some sort of inner transformation. Now, you can use the rituals and devotions in a psychological, powerful, transformative way. But if you use them as substitutes for that, that becomes fixating on purity. So there's many ways to interpret, but I want to point out that in this group, if we know anything about the times and so forth, many people were into many types of practices here that they thought were confirmations of his teaching, and he's pushing back a little bit. He's pushing back. He's, as I say, rubbing the fur the wrong way on this. And yet, he's coming back with principle. So, good and wise friend, what does sitting meditation mean? So now he tells you what it is as opposed to what it is not. To engage in this practice means you remain unhindered and unobstructed. Your mind and thoughts do not stir no matter what good or bad state or external situation presents itself. That is called sitting, and we put in quotation marks. And to inwardly discern the unmoving stability of the essential nature, this is called meditation. Now he's taken two terms, like he's done before, whether reciting the Buddha's name or making offerings, and now he's taking sitting meditation and he's redefined them. This sitting, again, is not the posture, it's not a place, it's not even a practice. It's a state of unmoving stability and equanimity, because you see there's not one thing to get, that all things fundamentally are dreams, illusions, bubble, shadows. Therefore, you do not stir over these things. You do not, in your essential nature, move. And at the same time, to observe inwardly, so whether outside states or inside states, and this is what Han Shan was going over last night. He was saying, externally, all these things appear. You do not close your eyes and ears to them, but you're not thrown off kilter by them. And inwardly, all kinds of states can arise, afflictions, desires, emotions, memories, dreams, and all this sort of thing, and you treat them the same way. You just watch their rise and fall. Watch their rise and fall. They have no life of their own, except that you give them something. And he says, this is the nature. When you can be there, that's sitting meditation. That's very different than just sitting on a pillow. It's actually a way of being. And then he goes on, he says, good and wise friends, what is meditative concentration? What does that mean? Again, he just reemphasizes, remaining detached from external appearances is called meditative. Remaining inwardly undisturbed is called concentration. If you attach to external appearances, inwardly your mind will become restless and confused. This is really good, and it's matching what I quoted you last time on the Qing Jing Jing, the classic purity of stillness. That text says, because our nature is naturally still, but our thoughts disturb it, our mind is naturally calm, but our desires entice it away. He says, once it's enticed away, this is what happens. You then become restless and confused. Because you think, I'm not whole and complete, I don't have it, it must be somewhere else other than here. And he says, thus begins the acquisitive, restless, anxious mind. The free-floating anxiety that we associate with modern life is actually very ancient. It's this constant restless anxiety that propels us forward. You want to say, what is the driving dynamic of modern society? It's a sense of, I don't have it, I lack. Something's not there, I need to get it. And this compulsion, it becomes a compulsion. It's really like the wonderful parable about the Chicken Little, but it wasn't. It's an actual Jataka tale. I know now you know it's a Chicken Little tale. You know, Chicken Little. Okay. Yeah, the sky is falling and hit me on the head. Well, there's an earlier version of a breadfruit that falls, and the monkey freaks out and goes running and says the sky is breaking up, it's collapsing, the universe is almost over, and all the animals stampede. Right, until finally they get to the Buddha. Whoa, wait a minute, what's going on? Well, the sky's, who said it? And it goes through the giraffe, the monkey, and the monkey says, oh, no, I know it, it hit me right in the head. And then they go back to the tree, and maybe it's not falling. But the same thing, you could take it as a parable for our anxiety, the stress that drives us. We mistake something lacking. And because we mistake that, we begin an anxious, restless questing that, in a sense, becomes insatiable because there's nothing that we can get that ever fills it, and so forth. It just keeps going and going and going. So he's talking here about both meditation, but I think he's talking about a fundamental thing about life. If you attach to external appearances, in other words, attach means you identify with them. You think that they will give and bring you something fundamental. And as long as you have that idea, when you attach to them, you will only become restless and confused. If, however, you remain unfazed by appearances, now unfazed means it's not that you don't notice them, but you just don't get moved off by them. Inwardly, your mind will be unperturbed. The essential nature is naturally pure and still, but becomes confused when we let our thoughts chase after things we see. Or, anybody else want to finish that? Well, think of the six sense organs. So our eyes chase after things we see, our ears after things we hear, our tongue after things we taste, our body after things we feel, and so on and so forth. So you go through the sense organs and their sense objects, and that's what he's describing here. And that's what he means by lost in the sensory flow. Because you're grabbing and grasping at these sensory objects, but they just lead to more restlessness and confusion. If no matter what situation we encounter, our mind remains unconfused, this is true concentration. Now, unconfused means unmoving, but it doesn't mean he doesn't say if in every situation we encounter we remain dead and unconscious, this is true concentration. No, he's not saying that, because that's another form of attachment. Just as wanting them and grasping them is a form of misunderstanding, so is rejecting and pushing away and thinking if I just isolate myself from all phenomena, I will be pure and unmoving. Both are the same side. That's why in the terminology, grasping has both those dimensions. It has the dimension of craving and wanting, and also, again with the hand, rejecting and aversion. And he's saying, in the midst of these things, what he's talking about, so that you are in the midst of movement, you are still. And in the midst of stillness, you're still alert and responsive, and that way moving. So this is called the non-duality of movement and stillness. It isn't saying movement or stillness. It's saying movement in stillness. Movement in stillness means you're alert, you're aware, you're responsive. He talks about this again and again. You don't attach, but you respond. Everywhere unattached, everywhere engaged. Okay? But the opposite is true too. In the movement, in the responsiveness, there's still an eternal eternal, internal equanimity and calm that's not grasping or attaching in the midst of all that. That's the balance that you hope to achieve, and that's what he calls meditation. So we'll finish this up. Good and wise friends, outwardly detached from appearances is meditative, and being inwardly unconfused is concentration. This combined outward detachment and inner lack of confusion is meditation. Now, this means that you could be sitting in this hall, unmoving, and not be doing meditation. What are they doing in there? If somebody comes in, what are they doing in there? Shh, they're meditating. Maybe. Maybe they're just creating all kinds of trouble. They're scheming, they're plotting, they're, finding fault and whatnot. They're thinking about dinner and yesterday and tomorrow, and they're meditating what? They're unmoving, but whoa. So he says, I call it only the outward detachment, meaning not clinging to it, and the inward lack of confusion. That's meditation. And then he says, the Bodhisattva precept says, our original nature is inherently pure. Good and wise friends, in every moment of thought, never lose sight of your purity and clarity of your own original nature. You must cultivate your self-practice and realize the Buddha way. This, by the way, is very interesting because the opposite of this a little bit would be like, okay, you think you're cultivating the way because you're really good at I'm really good at finding faults of others. I really have discerning wisdom. I can see through that comment. I can see through that gesture, blah, 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 blah. And you're not. But the equal mistake is to think that if you just draw near to a good and wise teacher or something, you're okay. In other words, well, then if it says, never lose sight of this, I'll be okay if I do that. And that's not the case either. So this is very important to understand, because when I say it's a transformative teaching, it means it is self-transformative. It is not being transformed by someone else or something else. And this is really important. That's why there's that famous line from the Dhammapada, no one liberates you but yourself, no one can and no one may. You yourself must walk the path. Buddhas only show the way. And you see this with Ananda, for example. Ananda, who's becomes a great arhat. But in the beginning, Ananda thinks, okay, I won't find fault or anything. All I have to do is just keep hanging around with my cousin, the Buddha, and it'll rub off of me, and I'll just go off to pure wisdom, enlightenment, and whatnot. And the Buddha lets us go for a while. And then finally just hits me on the head, what are you doing? No Buddha got to be a Buddha by someone else's coattail or robe tails or whatever you want to call it. They had to do it themselves. And then begins a very difficult teaching for Ananda to set him on his own self-reliance and say, you need to cultivate your own mind. That's the only way this can be done. So again, how we look at this is both not to reject, if you want to say the parallel of external appearances, you don't reject others. That's part of not attaching to external appearances. But the inward part of not being confused is you don't turn and rely on something other than your own nature. I think this is the double message here. So we have it both outwardly not attaching, inwardly not confused, but outwardly not criticizing and judging, and inwardly not just giving up the ground of our own responsibility and saying something will magically happen to cause this transformation. So next we go into one of the longest chapters. So let me finish up with the story I was going to tell earlier, because it has to do with sort of the fault finding and learning this. Back some years ago, I took a job in a residential treatment center for severely emotionally disturbed kids in the Central Valley. And when you say they're severely emotionally disturbed, that's a nice clinical term. In reality, they're brats. They're miscreants. They're really obnoxious. They're not lovable. Really, they're not. You can say I love them. You all love them in absentia. But when you're actually living with them, it's really hard because they start fires, they steal, they beat up others, they torture animals. Let's see what else. They have horrible grooming habits. They fight, they lie, they cheat. Let's see what else I can go through. They run away and break into places, and we have to go get them back. They punch their teachers. They get bloody noses to their fellow classmates. Let's see what else. sometimes they get up in the middle of the night when everybody's sleeping and just start a fire in the fireplace, unsupervised. They even will kill and harm, you know. And so when I started working with them, my judgmentalism was in high form, and I could see in my mind there wasn't much that was lovable here. They really had many faults and bad habits. And my distancing from them was to judge them in that way. Now, the mentor I had was an older woman, and she was quite good. And she said, so what's happening? I said, well, I can't work with these kids. She said, you have to find something in each one of them that you love unconditionally, or you'll never have a foothold. She said, now it might be a very, very narrow foothold, maybe just a centimeter, but you'll have no purchase with them unless you find that and work from that. And I said, oh, I can't do it. She said, well, I've learned too, but let's try this. So there was one particular kid that I was in charge of, and it was just going very, very badly. And I was even worse. I was getting reports from school that he was fighting, alienating everybody, and just making a mess of it. And so we would go and observe the situation, and sure enough, for example, if a kid would bring in cupcakes or something for their birthday, before even they'd sing happy birthday, he'd just rip open the box and start grabbing and eating it. And the poor kid that brought it was really just crestfallen. And then on the playground, they do, like the game you call dodgeball. You make a circle, somebody, and they throw the ball. As soon as the ball came to him, he would just hold on to it or run away. And all the kids would get really upset and chase him, and just recess was no fun. So I wanted at that time, because the teacher called us in to do something, I wanted to intervene, and this mentor of mine said, no, don't say anything now. You'll embarrass him. I said, embarrass him? You're worried about embarrassing this little, She said, no. She says, just wait. So I said, okay. She said, if you embarrass a child of that age before his peers, you will always lose. You'll always lose, and you'll make the behavior worse. So at nighttime, we would tuck the kids in and often read them stories. And so I would listen outside the room, and she would tuck them in, and she said, boy, that was a tough day today at school. Yeah. He's kind of soft, and he realized. And then she said something funny. She said, must be lonely, huh? And he got this little tear in his eye. He said, yeah. And she said, well, David, she said, I know you really want to make friends, and you want to have people like you. And he said, yeah. She said, but the way you're doing it won't work. And the whole thing reversed. Instead of scolding him and the whole thing, she said, I know that's what I want to do, but this won't work. She said, but I can teach you something that will work. He said, like what? She said, well, tomorrow morning we'll get up early and we'll bake some cookies together, and you take them to school, and you give them to everybody as just a present. And then you take your share last instead of first. Yeah, really? I said, yeah, you just try that. And then she said, on the playground, what I want you to do, instead of, when you get the ball, holding and taking it away, pass it on to somebody else really quickly or throw it back in. And even when it's your turn, because when it was his turn, he got hit, then he refused to get out. And she says, as soon as you get hit, just get out and go back in the circle. And she says, now this may sound simple, she says, but I can tell you people will be much happier and like you a lot better this way. And so he went back in, and he trusted her, and he worked these two things, and sure enough, the whole tide turned. I was going, wow. So it's like an illustration of this passage in the sense that I was judging and dismissing, and then I was going to scold and punish him for his behavior. And I didn't understand, and she said, all of these kids basically learned this behavior. This is not their nature. They learned this behavior as a survival mechanism. Because they were neglected and abandoned, they got no attention. The hunger for attention at that age is fundamental. And he got attention. He got attention by doing this. He said it wasn't positive attention, but for him at this point it didn't matter, it was attention. Because he was afraid without this, he wouldn't get attention. So that bruise and the lack of attention allowed this to seem like this is better than nothing. I got everybody pissed off at me. They're all paying attention to me. He couldn't possibly, she said, he can't imagine stepping out of that unless you give him some technique that he can use. And she said, it's been my experience every time, once you give that technique, they will naturally gravitate to that, to replace the other because they can see. And sure enough. And so that became one of the things I tried to use, was to see them in a wholly different light. And she says, they don't know any better. And she didn't mean this like they were morally incompetent. They don't know, meaning they didn't learn any better. And sure enough, what the program eventually led to was to say, well, where did they learn this? And that led us into not just severely emotionally disturbed children, but their parents that were in fact teaching them to behave in these ways because of the lack of attention, because of the lack of nurturing and so forth. The children, desperate to have these needs met, would go about in their own sort of helter-skelter way to get them met. And gradually this thing just escalates till they end up in prison. You know. And so, again, I just want to illustrate this is by changing the definition of what a human being is and seeing it as a not and as an affliction and not as a fault, you intervene in a different way and it has a totally different effect. So I think, you know, there's many ways to read the text. That's one. Anyhow, so no more questions, right? Locke fell asleep. That's good. Any announcements? The monk got sick? That's your announcement? Well,
it's very interesting. Our new chapter will be Repent and Renew. Actually, the 10,000 Buddha repentance will start this weekend. The city of 10,000 Buddhas.
Ah.
So young people come in during the weekends. No, 1 hour reservation.
this is also something, it's going to be a very interesting chapter for all of you. Those of you who are coming from, say, like my background, originally Catholic, the idea of repenting, it has a very distinct landscape to it, psychologically. And even those of you who have been practicing Buddhism for a long time, I think you're going to find this chapter very interesting. Because although he does continue the ritual acts of repentance, he comes at it completely from the mind ground and redefines what you're doing when you're doing the bowing and repenting, which is very different than just ritualistic performance. And in fact, all of a sudden you see this might be his real chapter on meditation. The real secret of the Sixth Patriarch's meditation teaching is here, not in the sitting posture, which is very interesting. Heng Sure did his doctorate on the mind ground sort of Chan dimension of repentance ceremonies. It was very, very useful to look at these things that have become sort of large ritual devotions and to a lot of people's minds sort of external other power, Tali directed. He went back and again, if you look at it, he wasn't making this up, because if you look at the verses of contemplation within these ceremonies, all of a sudden you see they're mind ground contemplations. Very interesting. You're not bowing to someone else, you're not bowing to another power, but you're actually opening up your heart in a very fundamental way with those contemplations that go with these. They're all mind ground contemplations. But that's another topic. Maybe he can talk about it when he comes back from Australia. And they won't let him bring his birds with him. Okay, so next week we'll start a new chapter, and we'll do the transference. I assume tomorrow there's a lecture here. Am I right?
Yes. Same old schedule.
Okay. May every living being, our minds as one and radiant with light, share the fruits of peace with hearts of goodness, luminous and bright. If people hear and see how hands and hearts can find in giving unity, may their minds awake to great compassion, wisdom, and true joy. May kindness find reward. May all who sorrow leave their grief and pain. May this boundless light break the darkness of their endless night. Because our hearts are one, this world of pain turns into paradise. May all become compassionate and wise. May all become compassionate and wise. Ing Li San Bao.